Okay, so welcome to the PRSA Midwest District Conference. I'm Bridget Cohn, Communications Chair of the PRSA Midwest District and President-elect of the Greater Kansas City chapter of PRSA. Before we get started, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. PRSA requires that we share the official antitrust statement for the organization. Because it's a couple of paragraphs long, and I know we wanted to get started with our program, I ask you to read the statement on the Midwest District website, prsamdc.org, and open the district conference page. Today's session is being presented as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, so we can have more interaction. Please mute your mics if you haven't done so already. If you have a question, please submit it via chat. And as you probably noticed, the session is being recorded. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Jackie Clark. We are here. I should probably make sure everyone is on, knows what session they're attending. We're in Tuesday, November 16th, session 5, the ROI of DEI, building diversity and equity into an organization. Jackie Clark, APR fellow PRSA, is LafargeHolcim's West Region Government Relations and Public Affairs Leader. She directs the company's public and government affairs, as well as political action, community relations, and crisis management programs. In 2006, she was president of the Greater Kansas City Public Relations Society of America and earned recognition for her exceptional national service developing and leading her chapter. In 2009, the GKC PRSA named her PR Professional of the Year. In 2010, she was inducted into the PRSA College of Fellows, which represents the top 2% of PRSA's 22,000 members. And she's also the Midwest District representative to the Board of Directors for the national organization. Jackie.
Oh, Bridget, good morning. And good morning to all of the folks that are joining us throughout the region or around the country. I'm not sure where everybody is. We really appreciate you being here, and we will all appreciate your engagement in our discussion this morning. And with that, I want to introduce the panel right away so we can jump into a series of questions and to shape our conversation this morning. So welcome. I'm going to go in alphabetical order and introduce each panelist. And at that time, they are going to give you a little bit about their background and where they are in public relations today. Once we've gone through the three of those folks, then we'll start in and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that is creating a return on investment in various types of organizations. So again, welcome and good morning. I hope everybody has their caffeine beverage of choice ready to go, or non-caffeinated if you can't have caffeine. So with that, I want to introduce the woman with the raspberry beret, who I love, and that's Shanita Akintonde. And we always respect our guests, and we learn to pronounce their names, which I have tried to do, and she probably will jump off if I screwed up. But Shanita is a doll, and I want to introduce her. She is joining us from Illinois this morning.
Good morning, everyone. I am Shanita Baraka Akintonde, MBA, MED, DTM. I add those letters because our esteemed moderator, Miss Jacqueline Clark, has MPA, APR, fellow PRSA behind her name. So I think we're either fans of alphabet soup, but more importantly, we like to give those distinguishing characteristics, which I will touch on further with you this morning. I am from the Windy City. I am popcorn pleased to join y'all this morning. And if you know anything about Chicago, you know that Garrett's Popcorn is where we are like embedded. I want to say it's the home of Garrett's Popcorn. And if you have not had Garrett's Popcorn, see me in the chat and I'm going to talk to you. I am thrilled to join my fellow panelists and to have, again, Jacqueline facilitate this. Ms. Eva Kaiser, good to see you as the president-elect of your PRSA Midwest region, or whatever the moniker is. Correct me if I'm not saying that properly. Thank you for having this discussion. I will just give you a brief background of my trajectory in our wonderful field of PR, and I'll pass it to my colleagues. But what I will intersperse throughout the dialogue this morning is that this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my humble opinion, is never deficit-based. And by that, when I share my story with you, I am not coming from a place of, oh, poor thing, you know, what is it that we could do better to help you? I get a little bit concerned when that becomes the framing around these types of conversations, which is why I'm so glad that the leaders here and those of you on this call are not coming from that perspective. As a matter of fact, when we joined this morning, Jacqueline showed us a gift basket, and you may want to tell everybody, but she got this abundantly filled gift basket. And I was like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yes, and abundance. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago, 2-parent household. Fast forward, don't worry, I'm not going to take you back down to the Little River, y'all. I started that, but I'm going to fast forward. Graduated from high school, went to college, and this is where the story ties into diversity, equity, inclusion, and our discussion today. As a graduating senior, I stumbled across an organization called the Public Relations Society of America. Yes, I was a senior. I was an advertising major, but they had a scholarship they were offering. And I thought anyone that had scholarship written on it, Shanita, then Bishop, was going to apply. So I applied for the PRSA's Diversity Multicultural Scholarship and was the first recipient of that from the Chicago chapter. That introduced me to public relations because they gave me the money that allowed me to graduate from college debt-free. That also opened the door for me to the field of public relations because I'd only taken at that point maybe 2 courses. But because I'd gotten the scholarship, the Chicago chapter's leadership introduced me to some individuals in Chicago in the field. I got my first position. Here's why this is significant. I was trying to be an advertising copywriter, but advertising at that time hadn't caught up to our profession of public relations. They didn't understand about 25 years ago what diversity, equity, and inclusion looked like in the professional practice. I say that because I was more than prepared to go into that field. 6 internships, great GPA, graduated top of my class, no excuses. They couldn't find me, but PR did. And so when I went into that field and got that first position, that led me to meet my husband at one of the jobs that I went on. A successful contractor who was building the President Obama Center here in Chicago. We have 2 sons who now have gone on to study their various majors. But all that started because I got a scholarship that led to a job, that led to a family, that led to me now being a professor that teaches public relations. So that's a short version of my story, but the bigger piece of it is that you never know, my wonderful colleagues on this call, what one scholarship, what one tap on the shoulder of someone who may look different from you can lead to. And so that is why it's important to frame it in the yes and trajectory for colleagues versus the less than. So with that, I'll pass it on to my fellow colleague on the panel.
Thank you. Oh, I just love your story. You know, everybody knows that in PR, we all rehearse and we talked in advance, but this is, it just touches my heart. I love it. So next, I want to introduce to the group Tara Deering Hansen, and she's joining us from Des Moines, Iowa this morning.
Thanks, Jackie. And I don't know how I can follow that up. I'm going to try a little bit just from my story. I am from Des Moines, Iowa, born and raised. My mom and dad were actually from Des Moines, Iowa, born and raised. And I graduated high school thinking I was going to become an agricultural engineer. I went to Iowa State University, majored in ag engineering. And one of the reasons why I chose that path was because at my junior high school, they came to my junior high and they were looking for women and minorities to go into the field of science. And I'm like, I'm good at math and science, I'll go there. Got to Iowa State and started working. Well, actually, I got weeded out from the engineering department. I didn't like it. I was studying 24/7. I didn't like what I was doing. I've always loved reading and writing. And so then I went on to major in journalism. I started working at the campus newspaper and loved it. I became editor-in-chief of the campus newspaper, went on to do 3 internships in college at the Des Moines Register, the Omaha World Herald, and the Chicago Tribune, Shanita's hometown. And I went back and worked there full time. I went back and worked at all 3 newspapers full time. So I was a reporter after graduating Iowa State for about, I'd say 6 years, and got out in early 2000s and went into PR. I left the industry, went into PR, moved back to Des Moines, and started working for an ad agency. My trajectory in the field has been, I would say, kind of just a little here and there. I worked at the ad agency, worked for Bobcat Company, which was a construction equipment manufacturer, and then decided to get into more of a traditional PR role. And since then, to fast forward, I've worked at retail companies. For those of you in the Midwest, there's Come and Go convenience stores. I was their corporate communications manager. I was group vice president of communications for Hy-Vee Incorporated. They have about 250 grocery stores across the Midwest. So I handled their media crisis and community relations. And most recently, bringing us up to today, I work for Iowa Bankers Association, where I'm their VP of Marketing and Communications. And so I've been here in this role for about 3 years. As a trade association, we advocate on behalf of all the banks across the state of Iowa. And our members include the big banks like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, down to our rural community banks in towns like Brooklyn, Iowa, that some of the towns that you guys probably have never been to or even heard of. And through that, though, and through my role, I not only kind of give a face and name for the banks, but I also try to look in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion. Since I've been here, really trying to start that conversation, which we can go into later. But one of the things in the past year and a half that we've begun is a diversity task force. So we've tried to really garner and get some leaders within the banking industry in Iowa to serve on a task force and to provide our banks some direction on how they can start the conversation and incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives within their organizations. And as you can imagine, which we'll talk about more later, that varies across banks, not just because of where they're located, but because of their size. Some banks are more along the lines on this than others. And so that's the path that we're on. But I am happy to be here today. Thanks to Eva and Jackie and Bridget for having me, and look forward to the conversation with my colleagues on the panel today. So thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And by the way, I never got any swag at the Hy-Vee stores here in Missouri. So I'm just putting that plug in. I know you're not there anymore. So
you didn't meet Mark Wahlberg, I assume, huh?
No, I didn't. So that's okay. They confused Wahlberg with Whataburger in my community. So, oh well. Last for introductions, but certainly not least, as the phrase goes, is Angel Udine. And she is joining us this morning from Minnesota. She is from Michigan.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate the introduction. And I'm so glad to be here this morning with the esteemed panelists and with the rest of you who are interested in this topic. I love sharing, and so hopefully we'll be very abundant in that to Shanita's notes. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. And so when people ask me, how did you get into diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and how long have you been in it? Well, I'm a 61-year-old African-American Hispanic woman from Detroit, Michigan. I started 61 years ago. Because in my travels, most times, and again, focusing on abundance, I had great parents who made sure that we had the best and the most of everything and exposed to everything. We were the kids who had the symphony orchestra season tickets to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and also the Detroit Pistons seasons tickets for sure. So we were usually, my sisters and I, I'm the oldest of 3 girls, were usually the onlys in almost everywhere we went. We were the only African-American Hispanic children present in most of the arenas we were in most of the schools we were sent to. And so I saw that as opportunity, because it was one to learn what the rest of the world looked like versus what I knew happens in my household. I was fortunate enough to go to an HBCU when I graduated from a high school in Detroit, which is a very well-known high school, Cass Technical High School, college prep school. And that HBCU was Hampton Institute at the time, so telling my age for sure there, because it's now Hampton University. In Hampton, Virginia. And that was a great experience to be at an HBCU and to learn so much richness about African-American history and culture and all of the nuances. From there, I actually lived in Michigan for most of my life and lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and worked in the space of organizational development. And in that organization, my role was to assess what the how culture impacts the bottom line of major organizations with Dr. Daniel Dennison. This really started my interest in the DEI work, but at that point in time, it was not called DEI. There was a blend of affirmative action, there was a blend of corporate culture, but it wasn't labeled as diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I moved to Minnesota, I moved here 24 years ago and worked for a design and manufacturing company that sold gift bags and stationery products to national retailers like Target and Walmart and Dollar Tree and the likes. That job required me to travel internationally, and most of my business was done in Asia. So I had to learn what global diversity really looked like. And particularly now, remember this Black Hispanic woman now travels to Asia. She's the leader of a manufacturing and design company, but yet can't sit at the negotiation table because of the cultural way in which business is conducted in Asia. So I had to learn those nuances and quite frankly, put that ego aside and allow my white male colleague to do all of the negotiation and to groom and guide him so that he would do that for the benefit of the organization. After being in that organization, I was able to parlay my experiences in OD and in business management into financial services. So I've worked for major organizations like Wells Fargo, US Bank, and then a regional bank called Bremer Bank. And that's when I got really deep into the DEI work. I was asked to be part of a panel. And when I got on that panel, it was to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization, which the organization had not broached yet. 75 years in business and had not had that conversation yet. We would get together each month and we would talk about what we needed to do as an organization, and yet we weren't making any headway. And when I would ask why not, I was told that it was because of resources and time. And I said, well, I don't understand. If we're doing this every month and we don't have the resources, tell me what the resources look like. What are we missing? And I'll throw my name into that proverbial hat to lead this charge because it's so important to me. Well, I kind of walked away from it for a little while and got tapped on the shoulder by the CEO and said, I think it's time. We're ready for those resources and to really make a commitment to DEI. And as a result of that commitment and doing that work, I was speaking at a conference similar to this. And unbeknownst to me, the CEO and the executive leadership team of Blue Cross Blue Shield was present. They heard me speak and asked me to come and join their team. So here I sit 2 years later as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Blue Cross Blue Shield. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with PR? Because I'm the only one on the team that doesn't have that PR background. Well, I'll tell you, quite frankly, doing the diversity, equity, and inclusion work is all about storytelling. It's all about helping people understand what this is and about convincing hearts and minds to come along for the benefit of the whole and telling the story about what organizations like Blue Cross Blue Shield do and how they're making impacts in communities where disparities exist. And so in that storytelling, that is my public relations connection. I'm constantly telling the story, not only of the organization, of our associates within the organization, but also the communities that we serve. So I'm thrilled to be here today to share some of those stories with you guys and be part of this great panel.
Thank you so much, Angel. And I love the enthusiasm of our panelists cheering each other on. It's awesome. So we're going to shift into the substance of our discussion today. But I really thought it was important that we set the table this morning so everyone joining us could understand the rich background that each of our panelists has to be part of this conversation. And, you know, one of the things that I've shared with each of them, because I have a little bit of a story, I didn't know until I was in my 40s that I'm part Hispanic, about a quarter. I had a grandfather who was adopted, and my mother was doing the research. And I felt quite strongly since learning that I need to do more and to be better engaged in these conversations. And one of the things that several of us in PRSA and beyond participated in earlier this year with the University of South Florida, they created a certificate program for DEI in the workplace. It's about an 8-week program, and you're nodding, Angel. And I thought that was really important, and that there was a lot of focus on return on investment and the business case for working on diversity, equity, inclusion. And you know, we've had quite a lot of attention focused in the media on the census. You know, we do that every 10 years. And some of the conclusions that were drawn from the census is that we will be what they call a majority minority country by 2040. And I think basic demographics tells us that we need to do the work here in this country. So with that, I want to pivot here to a discussion, and both Angel and Tara have already kind of alluded to describing their roles in DEI workplace initiatives. And I think, Angel, you mentioned the CEO tapping you. One of the key elements is, do you have your very senior leadership supporting the effort and allocating resources? So why don't you all, and I'm going to start with this one with Tara. I'll try to mix it up here so we don't keep going through the same process. We'll go to Tara, Angel, and then come back to Shanita for the third response. So go ahead, Tara.
All right, thanks, Jackie. And I would say, I mean, as I mentioned, one of the things that we've done probably in the past year and a half was really try to look to see what we're doing for our members and as an industry. Prior to that, internally, since I've started work with the organization, and as probably many of all of you do with your roles, is really try to look for ways to, in a non-structured way, to bring representation to our communications and voices, different voices. So that's something that I've done just in my role as VP of Marketing and Communications. With some of our publications, as you know, it's not just the faces, but it's the voices. We have a member spotlight in our publication. And I was seeing with my team a lot of the same faces and a lot of the same stories. And I said, I know there's other stories out there at these banks of people who have gotten into the industry. So I really charged my team to go out and ask for those stories and look for those stories. But in terms of more of a coordinated effort, and trying to really creating the diversity task force and really bringing some of the bank CEOs and leadership to the table, that was something that was supported by our leadership and by our president and CEO. It's something that I brought to them personally because it's obviously something that I cared about and that I had experience in doing. But I will say, you know, it was something that took a couple of conversations. There was some feedback of, well, we've talked about this in the past. It's been part of our other committees. But then my question was always, okay, well, what progress have we made? And I think now is the time, with obviously recent events and with things that have happened, that we make it a more concerted effort and we take it out of just being a bullet point within a committee, but make it something on its own. And so that was something that was supported by our organization. And to be quite honest, it's something that we are just starting with. The task force at this point is going to be short-term. I hope that it extends to being long-term, but we're really looking at resources and things that we can provide to our banks that are DEI focused, because one of the struggles that we have, which we'll talk about later in the session, is we have banks of all different sizes and they're at different levels of where they're at in the DEI process. So I think the most important thing is having leadership that at least is supportive of bringing people to the table and having the conversation.
That's great, Tara. Angel, how are we situated with Blue Cross there?
So, I think that when we interview for jobs, we need to see that that activity a smidge bit different. People presume that they're presenting their brand to the prospective employer and telling them who they are. But what I did in the case of Blue Cross is I wanted to know who they were, and who they were was around how committed are you to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is it a box check? Because many organizations are either just starting this journey or have started it, but it's a box check because their board told them that they needed to, or their community told them that they needed to. So the first question I asked our CEO was, tell me your definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to hear it from your mouth, not just those acronyms, but I want to hear what you think that is. And so, what's important is understanding that the top performing companies, 35% of the top performing companies in the country are of diverse mix. And the reason why they are is not so they can meet a quota or match numbers or anything of that nature, but they understand the diversity of perspective, experience, knowledge base, and the diversity of the customer base that they have, no matter what business industry they're in. And so as we talked about what diversity, equity, inclusion was, we needed to understand that diversity is, in fact, that diverse perspective. It goes beyond demographics. It goes beyond ethnicity. It talks about ability and a lot of other areas that we need to be cognizant of. And it also includes our white male practitioners or associates, which many times there's a thought that we are excluding them. And the reality is that their voice is just as important. And the equity piece is meeting people where they're at so that we can assure the desired outcome in the business endeavors or the community relations that we have. And then finally, most importantly, is the inclusion factor, making sure that all those voices are heard, that you're not just bringing them to the table, but you're actually letting them speak and listening to what they're saying and incorporating in the decisions that are being made. So when we talk about commitment of DEI from the top level, within Blue Cross Blue Shield here in Minnesota, there is definitely a strong commitment. In fact, diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial health equity have been labeled what we call internally blue chips, which are top business priorities within the organization. And resources and attention is given in those directions and in those areas, to the extent that I actually meet quarterly with all of our executive leaders. And I go through the metrics, the measures, the results, the performance, and their personal cultural competency and how they're moving along the continuum so that they can lead a diverse workforce effectively. And then we also carry that down to our officers within the company. So this is something that is intensely and intentionally embedded within everything that we do at Blue Cross Blue Shield. And frankly, if it's not, it's really just a box check. People are experiencing that. Unfortunately, my colleagues in the DEI profession, many have gone through that struggle of getting organizations, leadership to buy in and to really walk the talk. I happen to say that I do work for an organization that does that. And also I will say, anyone who knows me knows that I'm pretty bossy. So either you're going to come along or you're going to get along. So we definitely, they can't shake me at Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm showing up like a bad penny to talk about DEI and how it impacts your business.
That's great. I love that. All right. And Shanita, give us your thoughts on this topic.
Well, diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. And I got that from Gail Dent, who's a PRSA colleague, and she sent that to me recently, and I want to give her a shout out. And I want to piggyback on something else that Angel mentioned. You know, W. Patrick McSweeney and Marsha Pitts Phillips are my bookends on this DEI work. And Patrick is a white male and Marsha is a Black female, but I bring up their racial demographics only to say it takes a village. So when we talk about how we do this work, and what we do to measure and how we measure what's happening, we start with that one step. I got the invitation from both of them to be a part of this panel, and they shared my information to the muckety mucks. So thank you all for that. But when I look at how my institution, I'm a professor, this is my 23rd year teaching at Columbia College Chicago, and in my professional practice as an academician, when I look into my students' eyes, because we're face to face, we're masked up, eyes up. But when I look into their eyes, I see them as the future of our practice. And I see that as an opportunity to have outcomes fall out the way they should be based on what I'm putting into them. And I'm one person, but I intentionally focus on how I infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion in modules in my classes, how we talk about it. And the good news, everyone, is that this younger generation gets it a lot quicker, and they already come in a lot of times with a lot of this stuff like, really, you really think we need to hear you teach us this? So that warms my heart in that regard, because it makes me feel as though we're advancing in some ways. Obviously, we have a long way to go still, but there are some advancements happening with this younger demographic. So when I look at my institution, when I look at PRSA, which I am the past national chair of our diversity and inclusion committee, and I'm the current national chapter D&I liaison, when I look at how my institution, PRSA, and my own professional practice, I'm president of Shanita Speaks LLC, where I'm invited to come to organizations and talk to their leaders about how they can infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion into their professional practice. The idea of metrics and outcomes comes up a lot. PRSA has a diversity and equity. We have a diversity and inclusion toolkit, right? And we have all of these wonderful resources. But at the end of the day, when I look at measurement, I go back to what my great-grandmother told me when I asked her as a young girl sitting at that kitchen table, how does she make the collard greens and sweet potato pie taste so good? How much sugar did she put in there? How much, salt and whatever? And she looked at me and said, child, I don't use a measuring cup or a measuring spoon. And she patted her heart and simply said, I just feel it, baby. And so that's what I want to say to us. At the end of the day, it's about how we make people feel. That's the measurement. It's not complicated. So when you look around your spaces and places and the people that are with you, if they're working and they're looking sad or looking disengaged or looking as though, they have some ideas or thoughts, but they're waiting on someone to acknowledge them, then do that. I mean, it starts there. And then from there, you have a ripple effect that can be, as I said earlier, this little Black girl from the South Side of Chicago, in which PRSA said, here we go, we're going to give you the scholarship. And fast forward, and now I'm talking to you all today on this panel.
And thank you, Shanita, for reminding us about the PRSA tools that are available and for your leadership in developing them. We really appreciate your work. It's hard work. So when your organization got started, what was there a catalyst or just a business analysis completed that said we need to start moving in this direction, or was it more organic with employees saying, let's do something? And for this question, we'll go to Angel first.
Sure, thank you. So, Blue Cross has been around for quite some time, and it would be arrogant of me to say that their DEI journey began with me. It certainly did not. It began with a colleague who had great passion for the work because she came from public health, and she understood what it looked like on those floors in the hospitals and in the clinics and the importance of racial health equity. So for Blue Cross, diversity, equity, and inclusion came from a different perspective. It came from the disenfranchised and marginalized communities that did not have access to healthcare and health and well-being as the majority population would have. And so she did a lot of this great work by just enlightening and engaging leaders to understand the challenges and the barriers that exist for that population. She brought that work inside and really started to work very closely with our human resources team to help them understand that if we don't have individuals that look like the communities we serve and can relate to the cultural nuances that are experienced in community, then we were going to be missing the mark, and we were going to be showing up as the white saviors, doing to community what we thought they needed versus doing for community what they wanted. And so that was the beginning of the work at Blue Cross Blue Shield several years ago. I joined 2 years ago, and we accelerated that by really focusing on how do you attract and retain top talent? And that's really critical, because otherwise you can start monitoring those numbers and really hoping that you hit those metrics. And to Shanita's point, but if people aren't feeling as if they belong and that they're in the right place, they tend to leave by the back door. And what we wanted to do is make sure that we retain that top talent, because as many of you know, to recruit and attract talent and onboard them is a very expensive endeavor. And it also takes time and commitment. And the last thing you want to do is make that investment and have people go out the back door. So when I joined the organization, I did a walkthrough and asked all the stakeholders throughout different levels of the enterprise what diversity, equity, inclusion looked like from that organization's perspective, or from their personal perspective, I should say. And what were some of the successes, and where were we still having challenges? And so as we talked about those things, we developed our key strategies, which were around attracting and retaining top talent, mitigating bias within our policies, practices, and procedures, and then also really focusing on making sure our leaders were culturally competent to lead a diverse workforce. In doing that, we're able to really impact the organization's outcomes and what we do in community and how we can be successful. So the journey of Blue Cross, I will say, and I intentionally call it a journey. It is not episodic, and that's the unfortunate thing. And really, quite frankly, being here at the epicenter of last year's racial unrest, it had been a huge wake-up call for many progressive Minnesotans who discovered that they potentially could have been complicit in a lot of misdoings to individuals that was not part of what they intended. We really had to take a step back and say, let's make sure we're doing the right thing. We have to walk the talk. If you're going to be an organization that says we're going to end systemic racism in healthcare and we're going to be an anti-racist organization, that's a big lift. So now we have to walk the talk. And it is a process. It is a journey. It is not an episode. It is not a moment in time. And it takes a long time. If you're one who works in DEI and you think that we're going to arrive at the destination within X number of years, however many quarters or whatever your measurement is, the reality is that the continuum just continues to move on, but you never are done in this work. And so fortunately, the organization has made that commitment, but it also, quite frankly, requires you to be in partnership with other organizations within the community. So you don't do this work alone, you do it as a collaborative, which is one of the reasons why I'm very connected to a lot of collaborative consortiums, if you will, here in the region, to make sure that we as a group in this area of the country are doing the best we can to lift this work up and see the value of what is important in community.
Thank you very much.
Jacqueline, I'm sorry. I just have to jump in here for 30 seconds. Angel, you're giving me goosebumps. Listen. She said so many things that I just want to touch on. She said back door, that they go out of the back door, your employees. And Angel, you don't know this, but I have a contributing chapter to a book that I entitled, my chapter is called Front Porch Organizations Backdoor Employees. And it talks about exactly what Angel was saying.
Exactly.
And I said, if your employees will leave for those reasons that were just articulated. And then the second point I want to say, and Miss Darren Hansen, you will appreciate this, my fellow Tribune worker. I write for the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Defender, and my column is called On the Front Porch. And the reason I call it On the Front Porch, again, to pick up on what Angel was saying, is it's not episodic, it's a journey. And I talk about my great grandmother's front porch and how we would sit on it and look at our relatives and other people that walked, the path in the South to get to the porch. Anyway, I won't get into all that, y'all. But the point is, all of those things that you just articulated, Angel, I am giving you an amen and a high five on. And I want to reiterate that this is definitely not a drop in the bucket dynamic. This has to be long-term. This is a long-term situation. And so that's important, I think, to reiterate. So I just want to
thank you for that, Shanita. I think that sadly, some leaders do want to put DEI work into those quarterly metrics. And certainly there are things you can measure. But again, like I said at the very beginning, you're dealing with hearts and minds and history for individuals and where they grew up and how they grew up and where their people grew up and so forth. And this cannot be changed overnight. We'd love to put it in this corporate box and, put it on the conveyor belt and just hope it progresses. But the reality is it's ever unfolding and it does not end. And so it does frustrate some leaders because you want to see, like, they got this destination that they want to arrive at a given point in time, and they want to know how far away from it are we. Well, you know what? If that's the case, you should probably get off the bus now, because this is going to frustrate you going on this journey with us.
All right. Well, Shanita, I was good with you just taking the reins on the question. You were probably at the front end of some of the PRSA work on DEI, or whether it was D&I at that point in time, right, and in any of the other organizations that you've been associated with.
Yes, I started off by saying advertising was my major, and I segued into public relations, but I did go back to advertising after I had a couple of degrees under my belt. They woke up and said, okay, Shanita. So now I'm fully invested in advertising, marketing, and public relations, a MAP, M-A-P. And that's because I heard a colleague of mine say that sometimes, particularly African-American or Black people, if you don't get the love, so to speak, from one group or one organization or one entity from a professional practice perspective, you join others, such as the National Association of Black Journalists and all these other organizations, perhaps because the doors are open and it allows you to get and mingle with colleagues in ways that you may not have gotten from your chosen area of practice. But that's, again, another conversation. I am very active in organizations, not only because of the title, but because of the work and the perspective that I'm able to bring to the table. For example, what Angel was saying about being first, there's an acronym I use called FOD, which is first, only, and different, which in a lot of times or a lot of spaces that we occupy, whether it's because you're Black or a woman or Hispanic or Latino, whatever the moniker or the banner is, when you find yourself in those spaces, what I use it as is an opportunity. And I often say now, thank you for me being the one and only or the first, because it gives me a chance to not only invite others, but to give hopefully a different perspective. Now, that being said, I'm not Atlas. I'm not trying to put the world on my shoulders. We're not monolithic. So just because you get Shanita Akintonde, you're not going to get every Black woman in America, as you probably can tell from the Raspberry Beret. But you will get a perspective. And because I've been doing this for almost, should I say this? Almost 35 years now, I do have some vested time and energy and really, ear to the ground dynamics that I'm willing to share. And that helps. And I'm told that it helps. And so within PRSA, the American Marketing Association, which I sit on the Chicago board for, the advertising federations, et cetera, I am very proud to wave my banner and walk into those spaces confidently and assured, because now I've put in the work and I'm able to pull those behind me along as well. So I appreciate you asking me that, Jacqueline.
Yes, ma'am. You're welcome. All right, Tara, you want to wrap this up about how your organization got started with the DE&I journey? I love that, by the way.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of great comments. One of the things that I noticed when I started at my organization is that they were very much focused on women in banking, the gender piece of it. So they had started a lot of work there. They had done a lot of work there. But I would say that beyond that, in terms of other groups, whether it's sexuality, ethnicity, race, they hadn't dipped their toes in that as of yet, as to bringing people in terms of representation, bringing people to the table, having the conversation. And I think one of the things, that I hear a lot, I'm sure my colleagues probably hear a lot, sometimes maybe in their areas, is well, we don't have a lot of Blacks in our community. We don't have a lot of Hispanics in our community. And it's getting them to understand that it doesn't matter, and they probably do, but they're just not seeing them. I'm sure that they do have them in their community. They're just not seeing them. And so getting them to see their customers, getting them to see, their employees even that they hire. And we talked a lot about recruitment and retention. It's how making that business case of there are, with the labor shortage, there are people in your community that may want to come work for you, and you have to create that opening environment, that welcoming environment for them, and do it in a genuine way. So part of the efforts that we've done here is, really trying to move that conversation away from just gender, but actually making it more inclusive in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's been our main efforts over the past, I'd say, 1.5 to 2 years. The main thing that we're going to do, kind of like we talked about though too, is making sure that there's not an endpoint, and it's not a checking the box. It's something that continues, and those conversations continue. So again, there's still a lot of work that we're doing, great work in terms of women in banking. We're seeing a lot more women bank CEOs and a lot more women in the industry. But I think the great thing that we have is support from the organization, that they see that no, there needs to be more in terms of other ethnicities, other race, sexuality, that we're really making sure that we're feeling all people feel included. So another thing that we're doing too, there's different coalitions, as I'm sure in your guys' communities. There's one specifically that is focused on diversifying employees within the financial services industry. So we are a part of that coalition, and we really try to have that conversation across all of the other different institutions here in Iowa to figure out, how can we recruit and retain a diverse workforce, not just with obviously Iowa banks, but within other financial institutions as well.
Tara, I'm going to chime in with you just a second, because I did come from financial services, so I definitely understand your journey. When people would say, well, we don't have, the people aren't present in the market. We don't have women that we can recruit. We don't have African Americans that we can recruit, or indigenous peoples that we can recruit. I tell them that you're probably not looking where you need to look. That's part of the problem. You want to do the traditional pathway or passive way of recruiting top talent in those niches. The reality is that if you look at your state statistics, you'll find that the people exist. But where are you meeting them? You're not finding them. You're not taking effort. And what you do is you use your traditional checklist to wean them out, because you have a job description that says you have to have X number of years of employment, a college degree in specific disciplines and things of that nature. And how in the world would a woman of color, get a job in banking or have the 5 years of experience if no one's ever given me the opportunity to have the experience? And yet there are multitudes of transferable skill sets that are just as valuable to the work that you're asking someone to do that are not being acknowledged, and therefore weeding people out. So it's not that they're not present. It's just that you're creating artificial barriers that keep people from being able to be considered for those roles, and would be amazing in those roles, and really would understand the customer base that you're trying to attract, because they've lived that experience. And yet we tell ourselves these stories, these false narratives about not being present and people aren't interested. Yes, they are, but we just, don't open the door and welcome them in. That's the problem.
Y'all come right to Columbia College, Chicago. I have a whole bevy of students. I'm training them for you.
Right, exactly.
And this is, you all are nailing it. I was on our local school board, and the first thing we voted on was a contract to hire a gentleman to identify multicultural candidates. And by the way, this was the very first meeting of our Black superintendent, first ever Black superintendent in this suburban community. And I said, tell me why we're doing this. And of course, it was something that was happening before he came to the district. But he said, Jackie, there's a lot of work that has to be done here. And it was directly what you said. This blew me away, that education, where you have a diverse group of students, and oh, by the way, the student population was 25% non-white, okay? They were not recruiting at HBCUs. It amazed me. You've got to go where the students are. And like you all said, there are organizations now that take names off of resumes, so you don't have that name bias. If it's not John Smith, that candidate gets pitched. And then, like you all were talking about, the education factor, it is amazing the barriers that we have to finding and identifying quality talent. So,
it's important to note that PRSA, and this started when I was the National DEI chair, and it's continued. We earmarked a committee for HBCUs and HSIs, so historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions. And now I'm proud to say that our organization is starting a very intentional fellowship program, if you all aren't familiar with it, where we're not only awarding scholarships specifically earmarked for those students at those HBCUs and HSIs, but we also have a fellowship initiative that is going to help them segue their PRSA membership into becoming full members of our organization. So Felicia Blow, our president-elect, has more details, and you all can hit me up in the chat, or we can talk offline, Jacqueline and others, but that's really something that we are intentionally doing. And to Angel's point, go to where the students are, because, my son's at Morehouse in Atlanta, business student, and there are tons of students out there that are ready. They just need to be seen and heard.
And let's not forget our students that are at community colleges, because we tend to gravitate to the four-year colleges and institutions, but we forget that there is really strong talent and interest in those community colleges. There just might be a reason for that individual being where they are at versus at a Morehouse or a Hampton.
Right. And then I'll take it a step further. I mean, I'm at a PWI, predominantly white institution, PWCU, which is what I'm a graduate of. And I mentioned that I got the PRSA diversity scholarship. So you also have students who attend traditional PWIs, right, who are a part of the dynamic. And y'all check this out. Even my students who are not students of color, guess what? They're getting infused with this type of information as well, because it takes a village, as I said. So it's not only the students who, I don't look at the HUE, H-U-E, I look at the WHO, the WHO. Well, so that's what we need to look at, right? Our students as an aggregate, are we giving them the tools they need? Because they will be the decision makers.
That's right. All right. So if we're thinking about the work that's being done already, I want to go around again, and Shanita, I'll let you lead off on this round to talk about the successes and the progress that you're seeing made, and if you've got some measurements or tools for measurement to weave into this conversation, I think the participants would appreciate that too.
Sure. So I will be populating the chat momentarily with a whole bunch of tools. I will give you all the link to the PRSA's D&I toolkit, just in case you don't have that. And that is a camera ready, so to speak, opportunity. It's been translated into Spanish. We're very, again, intentional about the work, as was said earlier, walking it and talking it. That is a resource for those of you who are in chapters in your local regions of PRSA, or just in general. You can use it in your workplaces, right? It's transferable. The other things that I will share with you are some ways in which you yourselves as an individual can do this work, because it can sometimes appear to be overwhelming. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what I like to do in workshops I facilitate is unpack those words. I gave you a little kind of poetic reading a moment ago about what they mean, but if you put 10 people in a room, you'll get about 15 different answers as to what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean or stand for. And so I think the real fundamental is to start conversations, and to start those conversations with people who are different. If you look around your workplace and everyone has the same haircut, same car, y'all live in the same neighborhoods, wearing the same colognes and perfumes, you probably want to start to mix that up a little bit. And then lastly, and I think this is also important, there are books and articles and other resources that you can look at and tap into. I know there's a bit of fatigue, like we have Zoom fatigue. I think there's a bit of fatigue around sometimes adding more of this kind of work, so to speak, to our plates. But let me say this, it's very much a pay it forward mentality that I want people to consider. The front end can be a little laborious or seem overwhelming, but let me tell you, on the back end, it's so beautiful because the results speak for themselves. Data shows that those organizations that are more diverse, that infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion practices into their practices, have more money coming in, they make more headway, employees are more engaged, retention is better. So there are metrics in place that show that there's value in what we're saying. And it's not just value, feel good, which is important, but actual literal value that comes out of this work.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Tara, do you want to share with us some of your progress and successes?
Yeah, I would say with us being early in the process, I don't have tons specifically at my organization. I think the biggest progress has just been the conversation. It's a conversation that hadn't really taken place before to the depth that we're having it. So I think, as Shanita said, it's really being able to have the conversation with people who aren't like you, and the willingness for them to have the conversation, and making sure that it's coming from a place where they want to put forth the effort, they want to put forth the work, they want to support you. And that's really what's happened with us. The other thing that we are doing as well, you know, you guys mentioned kind of the HBCUs and trying to recruit there. That's something that we are looking at, and that we work with the NAACP on here locally. And then also too, we are working with getting some outreach and some connections with HBCUs to try to actually pull some people and pull some potential in terms of talent to the area. But yeah, in terms of measurement, we really don't have anything except for just those initial conversations that we're starting to have here within the organization.
That's great. All right, Angel, what Blue Cross and Blue Shield? I mean, you guys sound like your DEI initiative is pretty well woven in to the fabric of the organization, and you're driving towards results. You know, how would you characterize some of the biggest results that you've had, and with any of the stakeholders, or as many as you wish to talk about?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jackie. You know, it's interesting. Just last week, I sat down with my boss, and we were laughing because 2 years ago, I walked in with 2 pieces of paper, and it had 14 different questions on it about the demographics and the data that one might find typically in an ATS system, or, you know, basically that's where you capture all of your associate information with their demographics, as well as our performance as an organization, our customer makeup. And to my glee, quite frankly, here we are 2 years later, and what has stemmed from that is we have dashboards for all leaders throughout the organization that talk about how we onboard, how we develop, how we advance, and how we promote individuals within the organization of every demographic, not just our African American or our Hispanic or our Asian population. We do an employee engagement survey, and 2 years prior, this has always been just something we've done as an organization. And quite frankly, I hate employee engagement surveys because to me, they're the mechanism that institutions use to pat themselves on the back at the end of the year. It's not necessarily to really take a barometer on where the organization is and how the lived experiences within the organization, but we disaggregated that data for the first time last year so that we could see what that really looked like. And I was emphatic about saying I want to maintain our white population because we presume that they're thrilled and happy too. The reality is that there were areas for improvement for all of those demographics, and not always the same areas. So as a result of that, we convened what we called stay interviews. And, you know, in the employee engagement survey, you can ask the questions, but they're on a range of from 1 to 5, how you feel about something. What we did was we wanted to get the qualitative data from that and ask them to expound on those scores and tell us more about what that really means and feels like to be part of the organization from the seat that they sit in. And then we share that data with each one of the leaders in a quarterly basis. And I ask specifically, what is your strategy to change these numbers? Both your representation numbers as well as your engagement scores. And how are you cascading that down to your direct reports and them theirs? Because we're going to have to be accountable for these numbers as we move along as an organization. Another instrument that we utilize quite extensively within the organization is the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory instrument that assesses cultural fluency and competency within individuals. As an organization, we are in minimization, which is the mid space where we neutralize everything, everybody's equal, and everything is we don't see we see differences, but we don't celebrate those differences, right? Well, if you're going to be an organization that's going to be an anti-racist organization and you're going to mitigate bias in healthcare and overcome the systemic racism that's in healthcare, you can't do that from a position of minimization. So what we do is we reinforce the learnings of cultural fluency throughout the year through use of a variety of different toolkits. Then they're discussion toolkits, simple to use, 1 page, anybody can facilitate it. When I designed them, I wanted to get ahead of any narrative as to why someone couldn't use it. So it is super simple. There's minimal pre-work just to get context of the topic, and then discussion amongst individuals in safe spaces and non-judgment spaces where you can talk about what that means to you. So topics such as unconscious bias and coaching and guiding a culturally diverse workforce in a virtual environment nonetheless. And then talking about, you know, systemic racism, one of the most difficult and uncomfortable conversations to have, but necessary conversation to have so people understand that. And so what we do is through those various different instruments and measures, we're able to really see where we're going, because what you measure matters. If you don't know where you were and you have no idea how far along the journey you're going and what you still have left to go, it's all an exercise. It's very performative, quite frankly. And so what we do is we utilize all of those instruments in conjunction to see where we're going as an organization. And it has gotten to the point where now there's a shared language within the organization. People are clamoring. They want to be a IDI QA, which is qualified administrator, so they can do the work and debrief groups and talk about cultural fluency. All of these things really have impact. And so we're starting to see those measures. We've annualized the use of the IDI instrument with all of our people leaders, including our executive leadership team and even our board of directors, so that we can take it on an annual basis, the month of March and April, and then see where we're moving along the continuum and what work needs to be continued. And we also, again, disaggregate everything. If we're talking about demographics, we disaggregate that. If we're talking about divisions, we disaggregate that, because we really want to really get to the root cause of some of the issues that we may be experiencing, so we can be our better selves and be better for our customer base. So those are just a few things that we're doing within Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we've had really strong success. People have bought in and want to be a part. There are a lot of people on that bandwagon, which is really funny, because I'll just tell you this. If for any of you who have these in your community, during the summer, you see these pedal bars where, you know, everybody's pedaling and, you know, there's somebody with the steering wheel on the bike, right? The reality is I equate my DEI work as that. And I tell everybody, we're all going to pedal. And we all have a destination we're trying to get to. I might some days be at the steering wheel and guiding us. Other times I might be on the sides pedaling. Sometimes I might be in the middle serving the drinks. I don't know. But the reality is it's a group effort and we all have to buy in, because if everybody's not pedaling, we're not going to get there.
There is a lot to unpack with all the resources. We could probably have a session on all of those the methods that you all are using to measure. So I want to pivot here, because we have to keep these discussions real among us PR professionals. All right, so Tara, I'm going to let you lead this one off, and it is, what are your challenges? What are your hardships? What do you need more resources to do on the DEI journey in your organization?
Yeah, I think I have a little different perspective, obviously, just because we're early on in the process with the work that we're doing here at the Bankers Association. So one of the things that, in terms of challenges, but really I see it as an opportunity, is really getting people to the table. It's one of those things where you want people to come to the table who have a genuine interest and passion and see the value of the work, but then also too, you want to bring people to the table who may be a little uneasy with the conversation and who can familiarize themselves with what DEI work is. So that's really what we've been trying to do as a task force. We've been trying to, kind of identify those people who have a genuine interest and passion in DEI work, but then asking them to bring in others, kind of using them as influencers and as recruiters to bring more people into the conversation. The other thing I would say in terms of just challenges, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, but it's more so getting our task force over the idea that, there's a certain way of doing the work, that there's not just one playbook for everyone. So that's one of the things that we've tried to do, is provide a multitude of resources and give them ways that they can, at least start the conversation within their organization. There's a lot of great resources from a PRSA standpoint, but within our specific industry, American Bankers Association has a huge list of tools and resources for our banks. So a lot of times we do pivot to that and ask them to use those resources. And then if they have other questions, then we can help them with that. But I would say, yeah, it's really making sure that people see that there's an end goal, but knowing that there's just not one way to get to that end goal. There's other ways and other avenues that you can take to do good work in this space.
Okay. All right, and then over to Angel.
I think one of the biggest challenges, and I will say, frankly, it may be a little heightened here in the Twin Cities simply by the nature, again, of us being at the epicenter of some of the unrest, is DEI fatigue. I can't tell you the number of times. In fact, we had, unfortunately, a session like this and someone forgot that they weren't on mute and said, do we have to talk about this again? There are many people who are tired of it and who don't want to talk, or who actually, quite frankly, are in opposition to any of these concepts and ideas. And so what I like to do is not judge or criticize. I like to openly engage, listen with curiosity, and learn. And so I will inquire with people when I hear that, tell me more about that. I'd like to learn. And being very genuine and authentic about that inquiry, not condescending or judgmental, because what it does is it helps both of us come to a place of understanding. I get what is so tiring to them and why they want to be over it. But then they understand through that conversation and the fact that I'm being respectful, that they can then share with me why they're not ready for it. They're not interested in having the continued conversation, and then hear me when I help them understand the importance and the value. It helps us move past that and continue in partnership instead of in disaligned tracks. This is really important, and you can't leave people behind. Now, there will be occasions where people just say, I'm not coming along. And so I just have to say, well, respectfully, this probably isn't the bus you should be on. There may be another one you want to catch coming along behind us. But, just understanding that there are two sides to this, and it's not all what I say and how I see the world or the work that I'm doing, acknowledging that there is fatigue out there and people are exacerbated and exhausted. And so they may not want to continue this journey, or they need somebody to lift them up and help carry them for a little ways along that journey. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
Absolutely. You're right about all of that. And then Shanita.
Well, I think you have two choices. We can be proactive or reactive. This is the world we live in. I'm always amazed at the kind of optional stance people take, as though there's an option for these discussions that we're having. It's not optional in terms of the world is changing. The world has changed. The pandemic, if nothing else, has taught us that things happen that we can't control. And so what I like to say, for those who are hesitant or who think, oh, well, I don't want to do this, or it's mind-boggling almost to me in the regard of, if you look at the analogy of, say, Netflix or any streaming apps that exist, right? The old school, the HBOs, the Showtimes of the world thought, no one's ever going to watch these shows, these TV shows, binge watch them. And, they didn't see that coming. Right? Blockbuster didn't see Netflix. We can go through history and see examples of this. And then what's happening now? Folks are what they're doing. They're calling it cord cutting. People are getting rid of their HBOs and their Showtimes and everything, and they're going to Netflix, right? And Netflix has these wonderful programs. Squid Games. Am I the only one that watched that? It was, very interesting. So get ahead of this, everybody. Jump on, get ahead of this. You can set it according to your own templates. You can create it how you want, how it fits into your organization. You can get in front of it, or you can be reactive and responsive. And we all know what happens when we are reactive and responsive. That's when the panic button starts to get hit and we're scrambling. That's not a good look, nor is it something that I think any progressively forward-thinking organizations want to do. So utilize our resources, these experts who have this ability to help your organizations move forward, and do it, and don't hesitate. And then you can relax and you can look out of your window at everybody else scrambling around, and you can say, let me help you. We're not going to be the people that just laugh. We're going to help them, right? But I would prefer to be on the other side. I'm always preparing for what could be versus reacting to what has already occurred.
The one thing I would add too is that, another challenge is just the uneasiness of people and fear of wanting to be part of the conversation, whether it's fear of saying the wrong thing or not being the expert or not having enough education or understanding. And what I would advocate for is just get in there. I mean, if you have people who are in your organization, or if it's you, get in there and start the conversation, because you can learn as you go. Like, you can educate yourself. As long as you have the willingness, you can educate yourself. And obviously you don't want to make missteps, but I think what's most important is that you start. As Shanita just said, I mean, you don't want to be left behind. And as Angel just said, you don't want to be left behind. So start the conversation, have the conversation, try to obviously make those maybe within your organization feel a little bit easier about at least being part of it. If you can tell that there might be a genuine interest, but they're just a little fearful of seeing things or being, giving their input, give them a little nudge, because it'll be worthwhile to do that.
If nothing else, view it as great analogy for this is, during the summer months, you're clothed through the winter, if you happen to be from the Midwest, like all of us are, and all the things are hidden and the bumps are multiplying. And then the summer comes and we take our clothes off and go to the community pool or the lake. And the first thing we're afraid of is unveiling that wonderful winter body. And then we realize it's not so bad because everybody looks just like us. And then we step into the pool or the lake and it's super cold and you think, I can't do this. It's uncomfortable. And then within moments, you're swimming around and telling everybody how beautiful the water is. So, it is uncomfortable. It is difficult. It is hard work. But if you lean into that discomfort, the rewards are abundant. And so it is for the good of the whole. When you lean into that work, you become vulnerable. You share your hesitations and your successes and your challenges, because there's probably somebody sitting right next to you that's going through the same thing. And you can be accountability buddies and partners along this journey. You don't have to go it alone.
Yes, well, Angel, I'm not getting into the swimming pool. I mean, into the lake swimming around. I'm conquering the swimming pool. That's where I am with that. But
I'm right there with you. I'm just sharing it for all those other brave people,
the other
like
people
stand between their toes. I'm not a lake girl either.
I'm not a lake person.
I think that's a unanimous panel right there. That's pretty cool.
I go
I
once.
thought you
I go
might be
once a
doing
year
that,
to the
Angel.
lake,
I thought you
so.
might be doing it. I'm not in the lake yet.
Okay, now I got to keep us on track here. So we're needing to talk a little bit about what the future of this work looks like. Where are we going next, and what do we need to be thinking about? And Shanita, I think you mentioned what we don't want to be reactive. So we know where a lot of organizations are. I think the three of you have represented very clearly the types of spaces we're in this region right now, depending on our type of organization. And we're all in different places. So as we start to contemplate where we're going next, because some of the organizations that aren't very far along on the journey may need to, I hate to say skip a step, because I know there's important work to be done in every step, but it maybe accelerate to the next steps. Where are we now? And I think Angel, are you ready for the first response on that one? I think.
Yeah. I think one of the things is that we have to be very cognizant of what's happening in the world, and with our competitors and our regions and our markets. But what I want people to do is not be reactionary to headlines. Don't get caught up in the latest and the greatest and the thing that's the most prominent. Not to say ignore it, but don't be reactionary. When George Floyd was killed here in the Twin Cities, many leaders jumped out and said, in the town squares, we're going to be an anti-racist this, and we're going to do that. And what, even our leader was guilty of it. And what I said when asked, what should we say or do? I said, be very thoughtful, be very intentional, and be very pragmatic, because the reality is that people are going to remember what you said today, 18 to 24 months from now. And they're going to ask you, how far have you come towards that goal that you said in the heated moment? So be very intentional about anything that you say you're going to do, and where are you at currently, and how are you going to be able to assess along the way if you're successful in that effort. And to that point, really being intentional about reassessing annually, looking at what you said you were going to do and what was a priority to you, and then assess where you are this year. Now, as you begin, here we are approaching December Q4. Look at what you've done successfully and what you'd like to continue on that journey, making a priority. If there have been things that have shifted and changed and you needed to make a slight pivot, then make sure that you realign with those items, and then stay the course. Be consistent. Don't be fickled in this journey. Don't take on new and fancy baubles and trends. Stay the course, be consistent, measure what you're working on, broadly communicate it so that others are on the bandwagon with you and they support the initiatives. And just know that you're not in this game alone. Reach out to others in your field, in your industry, in your region, to talk about best practices and challenges, because you don't have to do this alone. You do it with others who are learning and going this route together.
And I like that you mentioned reaching out, because in the chat, Shanita has already said, reach out. So Shanita, other than that, reaching out, where do you think we need to be headed?
Well, I think that we need to look at one another and extend grace. I like what Tara said about there can sometimes be this shrouding of fear or concern that we have. We want to do it, but we don't want to make a mistake or a misstep or say the wrong thing or have something put out that is not landing as it was intended to land. And so what I want to say is, in this space that we're all in together, I always look at the intent behind the actions, and I extend grace, because there are going to be instances in which we all may make a mistake. That is not to me the issue. The issue is if you don't do anything at all. And I think Martin Luther King says indifference is the bigger problem, just being indifference. And the indifference is what happens when you don't act at all. And so what I want people to understand is we are all in this space together. We are all learning and growing. There are some of us who have expertise, but others who don't. We need to bridge that and to bring that together. But the point that I wanted to make is, when we look at this dynamic of moving things forward and pushing the needle forward, so to speak, I think it's important also to keep in mind that when we get there, and we don't know what that's going to look like, but when we get there together, as long as we approach it similarly to what I call the gumbo analogy. Y'all see, I use a lot of food analogies, but at the root of gumbo, if you don't know this, are 3 ingredients: onion, green bell peppers, and celery. And then you mix in the other things, but that's what's called the base of a roux. Now, if someone's on here from New Orleans, no, this Midwest, so nobody's on here from New Orleans and say, don't correct me. That's the foundation. And so to the points that are being made, just start that foundation strong. And when you build on that foundation and we look at the intent, then we can say, oh, they made a mistake, but the intent wasn't to be racist or sexist or homophobic. The intent was to do X, Y, Z. And then when you unpeel it, I think it makes it a safer space to land. And the last thing I want to point out is, if you think about the world that we're in, Sesame Street, did y'all hear about this? Just got a new Muppet on the show. That's their first Asian American Muppet. So this is Sesame Street. You know, we grew up on Sesame Street. They didn't have an Asian American representation on their show. So this is something that we're all learning how to do and to be better at. So I don't want us to be as accusatory as we are as focused on amplification.
Shanita, I'm as old as my chapter is almost. I didn't grow up on the Sesame Street.
Oh, well, did your children? Do you have children or your nieces and nephews or somebody?
Oh, well, yeah, the nieces and nephews, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Somebody.
never too late. You can start watching now.
Exactly.
It's a great show.
Because
At
everything
any
you need
age.
to learn, everything you need to know, you learned in kindergarten anyway.
Yes.
Well, Angel, it's probably on against Steve Harvey with Family Feud. I love watching those guys. It's the best show.
Okay, alternate then.
Yeah.
And there's a thing called DVR. You can take advantage of that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So Tara, you're going to get the last crack at that question, and then I'm going to get us to the point where we'll be wrapping up on time to follow our 9:30 cut.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. I was going to say, you know, one of the things that we can do in terms of where are we going is to really look at the younger generation too. We can learn so much from them as to what it is, how they envision PRSA to be and PR to be, and just our community to be. I've had people on my team who, you know, no matter their demographics, give such valuable insight and input as to how they view the world and how they view the world to be. So again, I think being proactive is a huge, and part of being proactive is looking and, you know, kind of turning and getting input from the younger generation as to where are we going. And so that's one of the things that I would say is because you can see that, you know, they're not waiting. The younger generation is not waiting to make changes. They know what they want. They know how they want their workforce to be. They know how they want the world to be. So even though we may have some people who are of the older generation who are used to having things a certain way, if they're going to get left behind in terms of workforce recruitment, they're going to get left behind in terms of being able to, you know, provide services and products to their customers if they don't figure out exactly where the future is headed, not just in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but obviously in other areas as well. So I really think, I mean, there are different perspectives that have even come to light for me with our younger generation and my team members, where they've brought a different perspective on how they view, whether it's, you know, for instance, I'll give an example. We give out scholarships and we have for a very long time. And there's more male scholarships than there are female scholarships for our high school students based on the state tournaments. And they were like, well, why do we have football and wrestling? But the only girl scholarships we give out is basketball. Like, why don't we have more equity in terms of the scholarships that we're giving out so that there's more females who are receiving the scholarships? And again, it's one of those things where it had been done that way for years, but no, there should be more equity in men and women and boys and girls receiving these scholarships. So again, providing that different perspective and really taking a holistic approach as to what we're doing. Just look at the younger generation. They are wonderful. They know where we're headed, and that's where we can get a lot of input from them.
That's so positive to wrap that question up with a focus on youth. And of course, for us, that's PRSA and our engagement with those chapters. We had a couple of questions that came in, and I want to do what I'm going to call a rapid fire round. one of the early questions today was, is anyone doing DEI well? And are there any models at all?
Well, from a branding perspective, I think that Procter & Gamble is doing a great job in the DEI space with their commercials. They have the look and the talk are two examples of ads that focus on racial demographics. I just mentioned Sesame Street coming out with their new Muppet, which is really great for them to consider doing. I think Starbucks had a faux pas with the Black Lives Matter movement, in which they told employees not to wear the paraphernalia in the store that said BLM. They recanted, and then Starbucks fixed the mistake, which I think is a good example, by not only embracing that, but also earmarking their own paraphernalia that had Starbucks logo, of course, with Black Lives Matter put together. So I think that's an example of how you learn from what your feedback from your demographic gives you, and you build on it. So those are just three brands that I think are doing a great job in that space.
And I would
Tara?
say, yeah, Peloton, thanks, Jackie. Sorry, I would say Peloton. I've been watching what the work that they've been doing in terms of community action. They've really stepped up, I think, with putting money in walking the walk in terms of, support and funding, in terms of trying to build to a diversity workforce. I also think that they do a great job. They have a new, obviously, marketing VP who's come in and has done a great job of having representation with just telling their story. And so I think, they had some missteps. There was obviously, I wouldn't say missteps, but there were some issues around and kind of, they got some flack around their commercial last 2 years ago during Christmas time. But I would say, obviously, it was a little, it is reactionary. We talk about proactive and reactionary. Kind of some of the things that they've obviously done has been in the vein of a company reacting after everything that transpired during the pandemic and with the racial unrest. But I have been admiring the work that they've done, and that they've been consistent, and that they've stuck to it, and that they give their customers updates as to the progress they're making on it, and they're measuring it. It wasn't just lip service. So I would say that they're doing that very well.
Angel, I'll have you take that last response, and then I know in the chat to weave into it, so we are up against our 9:30. They wanted to know about your stay interviews and if there's a resource you can share there. And I noted for the record here that everybody's available on LinkedIn, so we can keep the conversations going.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say all the stay interview information, it's homegrown. So if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'd be more than happy to go in depth with you and share how we went on that journey together. In terms of companies that are doing it right, I will say our three homegrown organizations, Best Buy, Target, and US Bank, have been doing a phenomenal job, but in ways in which maybe the public isn't as aware of. And so I'll just share some of the things that I have really been impressed with. US Bank has really invested a huge amount of capital in small business, minority-owned businesses in communities here recently, and been very intentional about it. And not in ways where it felt like it was PR or marketing, that it was very genuine and intentional to help sustain communities. So not picking and choosing specific businesses, but looking at the broad influence that business might have on community and help growing it. Best Buy has been very intentional about, and has for years, but has upped their game with their commitment to UNCF and really providing funding for students who are going away to college, who might be in those last years and needing that gap funding, and also providing employment post-graduation and really making sure that they're walking the talk and seeing it through the entire life cycle. And then Target, if you know anything about, again, the events of last summer, we had a Target that was sitting in the middle of a community that was greatly impacted by the violence and the damages. And Target not only rebuilt store location, but instead what they did is they went back to community and listened to their voices and asked them, what do you want? Not just in products, but the types of products do you want in your community? And where should we start looking in terms of minority business developers and products? And so not only did they bring that in to that particular location, but many of you probably have seen those little tags on the shelf that talk about Black-owned business. That is as a result of what happened here during that unrest and the commitment they made to lift up those minority-owned businesses, women and minority-owned businesses. So to me, those three organizations have done amazing jobs, and not necessarily in the big splash way that might be PR, but definitely in the where it has impact on community aspect.
Great examples. These are all easily found and identified. Thank you all for those great examples. And I want to thank each of you, Shanita, Tara, and Angel. Awesome conversation this morning. And I hope that our folks that are joining us now or will view this on recording in the future will benefit from the conversation that we had here this morning. I think we will be doing more of these conversations and sessions. And I, for one, would love to have you all back in person when we get to meet and kind of update where we are with the organizations that you all represent in the work. So we're getting lots of nice comments. So I know we are 2 minutes over, but I think it is 120 seconds well spent with you all.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us. It was a pleasure.
It was a
Thank you
pleasure
all.
and an honor. Thank you.